So it's June, and in honor of Pride Month, this episode I'm going to be discussing all of the LGBTQ characters in Harry Potter, both canon and fanfic. Uh, before all of that, I would just like to say everything that could possibly go wrong last time went wrong. So this is hopefully going to be much better quality than that podcast. Uh, Now moving on to our actual topic, probably the only confirmed Harry Potter, um, probably the only confirmed LGBT plus characters in Harry Potter are Dumbledore and Grindelwald, who are both gay and in love with each other. Um, I'm not going to go too much into the implications of this because it does have a major role in the Fantastic Beasts series, and no spoilers. Uh, but I am going to discuss some of the problems and or controversies around it. Now, the first thing that people like to point out is that it's something done by Rowling in order to gain publicity, etc., etc., etc. And while I do believe that that has potential for being true, I don't necessarily want to see it as a a sort of shoehorned in subplot, because it isn't that way. You can't exactly judge the sexuality of a 108-year-old man, which is how old he is by the time we meet him in the actual Harry Potter series. On the other hand, most of the Dumbledore and Grindelwald dynamic does play out in the Fantastic Beasts series, which is a prequel to the Harry Potter series. But since most of the movies in that series haven't been released yet, we don't have the all of the plot points for it. I'm not going to judge whether this could be true or could not. However, it does have some the characters do allude to it a little bit in Rita Skeeter's book, The Life and Lies of Albus Dumbledore, which isn't necessarily reliable, but there you go. The other thing that we see that kind of confirms this a little bit is when Travers, who is head of magical law enforcement in the timeline of the Fantastic Beasts series, tells Dumbledore that he and Grindelwald were as close as brothers. And Dumbledore responds with, "Oh, we were closer than brothers." Later in that same movie, we kind of see Dumbledore and Grindelwald together forming a love pact or a blood pact, whichever way you want to frame it. And this scene happens when Dumbledore goes to the Mirror of Erised, which, by the way, shows you the most potent desire of your life. For Harry, it was his parents returning. For Dumbledore, it's a little bit more ambiguous, but I would say that it is very much kind of similar to Harry, maybe a little bit more along the lines of his lost love returning or whatever. Obviously, he can't be openly gay in England at that time because homosexuality was only legalized in the 1960s. I believe it was 1967. But we might get to see some of that play out, and that's a very, very good thing. Obviously, the other side of this pairing is Grindelwald, who is the main antagonist. He's the main antagonist of the Fantastic Beasts series, although he does appear in Harry Potter as well when Voldemort kills him in his quest for the Elder Wand. Now, we don't have any concrete evidence again for Grindelwald's being gay, but given the fact that he and Dumbledore were apparently in a relationship, it kind of just a little bit solidifies that fact, unless Grindelwald was being a manipulative little idiot, which is, let's face it, that's not unusual for the antagonists of the Harry Potter world. Now, moving on, everything here is fan fiction. Now, all of the characters that I'm going to be discussing now are all characters who don't have a defined sexuality in the books. And this is strictly from the Harry Potter books, by the way. The other thing to be careful about in this discussion is, I am doing this with a fun, jokey, light-hearted air around it. At the same time, it's important to know that we don't at all support J.K. Rowling on her trans-exclusionary views. Transgender people are who they say they are, and their identities have to be believed. And gender and sex, while they are very often correlated, don't have to be. So transgender people aren't ill or insane, which is an argument that I've seen that is completely untrue. So our next character is Sirius Black, but before I jump on to why I think he's homosexual, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Project Health Warriors, who are the organizers of this podcast. Project Health Warriors is a non-profit organization that is dedicated to making sure that people get all of the healthcare that they deserve. All of the revenue that is generated from this podcast is entirely going to go towards charity and healthcare benefits. None of it is going towards the maker. If you want to support Project Health Warriors, you can go to our website, which is going to be in the notes down below. You can also follow our work, like this video, subscribe in case you're watching on YouTube. Otherwise, follow. This podcast is available on all major podcasting platforms. Spotify, Voice Notes, Apple Podcast, Google Podcasts, as well as on YouTube, which I would recommend that you go and watch it on YouTube, because that helps us the most. Now, going back to the fictional world a little bit. Sirius Black is another very, very popularly gay character. He is shipped with Remus Lupin a lot in his younger years when they were at Hogwarts. And the reason that I think this might be true is, for one thing, he's not assigned a sexuality, again, like all of the rest of the characters in Harry Potter pretty much. And we also don't see him in a relationship with a girl at all. Even though he's explicitly categorically mentioned to be extremely good looking and very, very popular with the girls while he was at Hogwarts. Now, I'm not saying necessarily that that's because he's gay, but that does lend itself to the possibility of his being homosexual. The other thing is his very, very deep relationship with Remus Lupin. Remus Lupin does marry Tonks, but that's after Sirius Black's death, which again leads me to believe that they might have been in a relationship. There's also absolutely zero possibility that Harry would have ever noticed his old Defense Against the Dark Arts professor and his godfather being a couple, even though they do act like, sort of like Harry's parents almost. Throughout the books, they buy him presents together. They apparently live together at Grimmauld Place for a while. And before Sirius moved into Grimmauld Place, he and Remus Lupin were living together at Remus's house in that's mentioned in at the end of Goblet of Fire, when Dumbledore tells Sirius to gather up the old members of the Order of the Phoenix and then lay low at Lupin's for a while. Now, it would make sense that two men living together might possibly be in a relationship. Not saying that's the only possibility, but they don't look to have been roommates, what with Sirius being in Azkaban and all of that. Another thing that is kind of in support of this theory is that Remus and Sirius are both outcasts of their respective communities. Remus, of course, is a werewolf, which means he is ostracized by basically all of the wizarding world, which is unfortunate but true. Sirius, on the other hand, is a blood traitor from a very, very well known pure blood family, which leads to his family, the Blacks, disowning him, and he even went and lived with James for a while as, kind of an adoptive sibling of sorts. Don't really understand that dynamic, but they were decently close. Another thing that now I think that two people who were such outcasts might have gravitated towards each other, of course assuming that they were both attracted to the same sex, which is not such a far cry. Also, at this point, the Harry Potter books are set in the 80s and the 90s, and much of Remus and Sirius's interactions are set in the 70s. But it's important to also take into consideration that, and I'm going to go into history a little bit here, but it's important to take into consideration that Britain decriminalized homosexuality in the 1960s, like I said before, and that would lend itself to there being an explosion of gay culture, open homosexuality, which is how it should be. So Remus and Sirius might have been in a relationship very publicly, very openly, without being treated with as much contempt as they might have been a decade ago, or in Dumbledore's times, for an extreme example. Now moving on to Remus Lupin from Sirius Black. Of course, I did cover the grounds for his being in a relationship with Sirius, but there's a couple more interesting points to analyze here. Remus, first of all, is never shown to be in a relationship with anyone before he and Tonks start going out, presumably, and then get engaged and eventually married. But all of that happens after the end of this, or during the end of the 6th book. Before that, when Sirius was still alive, Remus obviously didn't get into any relationship of sorts. He also did not, as that we know of, get into any relationships while Sirius was in Azkaban, which is kind of suspicious. A guy going just, I don't know, celibate, abstaining for 12 years of his life, and that too in like the prime of his life, when he was in his 20s and 30s. That's pretty suspicious. You really don't see that often. Now, having gotten my favorite characters out of the way in the beginning, maybe that wasn't such a wise move. I'm going to start to go into a little bit of the, shall we say, less favorable LGBT plus ships in Harry Potter. The first one that I want to tackle is Draco and Harry, which just no. I mean, I have nothing against Harry being gay or Draco being gay, but it just doesn't jive well with me that Harry and Draco would ever consider getting into a relationship. I mean, see, here's the thing. Every single time that we see Harry and Draco, with the exception of one, kind of meet in close quarters, they're either trying to kill each other, or trying to get each other killed, or trying to get each other expelled, which doesn't look good for them being in love. The only major exception to this is when Harry saves Draco from Crabbe's Fiendfire, which again doesn't mean that they're in love. It just means that Harry is a good person, which he is, and seeing as he killed the literal tyrannical world leader and died in the process. So it's really not good to say that he would ever get into a relationship with Draco Malfoy. In fact, he specifically says at the end of book 6 that he, even though he's a little bit sympathetic towards Draco's pathetic situation, he still despises him for his infatuation with the dark arts, which couldn't be more on point for Harry. The only time he's ever gotten into actual real bad trouble is for unknowingly using a dark spell that Snape wrote down in his book, which is just really not good either. Now, Harry's other perpetual character trait is that he still hates Draco. So the abomination that is Cursed Child, whether or not you consider it canon, is, let's not go into that. I kind of am on the fence about it. I usually don't. But even if you do consider it canon, most of that book is based in 2021, which is this year. And Harry and Draco still hate each other. They only team up in that book because their sons go missing in 1981, which makes zero sense. Another thing that kind of gets in the way of this situation, I don't even want to call it a relationship, it just seems so absurd to me. Another thing that gets in the way of this ship, there you go, I said it, of this ship, is just how toxic most of it is. I mean, yes, I have seen some supportive Drarry headcanons and fanfics, but the overwhelming majority is kind of bad, and I really don't want to get into the specifics of that. But yeah, the overwhelming majority of Drarry is not great, and that's because to make a ship work without completely changing those characters, you would have to have them act the same towards each other even after they get into a relationship, and the way they act towards each other in the books is homicidal rage. There's no other way to say it. The one incident being the exception, because Harry was just so damn tired of people dying. Another slightly controversial ship is Ginny and Luna, which I don't really ship, again, because Ginny and Harry are married and have 3 children and are very, very happy. But I don't really see a problem with Ginny and Luna. True, I mean, their actual relationship in the books is much closer to Harry and Hermione, in that they're jokey, laughy best friends. I can't see them being in a relationship, and also Luna is married to Rolf Scamander. If you didn't know that, she's married to Rolf Scamander, who's the grandson of Newt Scamander, and Newt Scamander is the author of the Hogwarts textbook Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them. Just a little bit of cool trivia for you. But I don't really see an issue, in Ginny and Luna being in a relationship, given that you have to ignore both Ginny and Luna being married to their respective husbands. The next relationship that we potentially see maybe a little bit is Demas, which is Dean and Seamus. Personally, I never really considered this when I was reading the books, and I've read the books through and through 4 times, which is more than I want to admit. But the thing is, the ship might well be canon as far as I'm concerned, because Dean and Seamus don't really have much romantic interest in anybody at all in the books. The only known pairing that Dean is in is Dean and Ginny, which kind of went nowhere, seeing as they had a rocky start and kind of a rocky relationship to begin with, and Ginny was in love with Harry. They were always breaking up, that on again, off again kind of dynamic doesn't really serve well to being a long-term relationship. And also Ginny is married to Harry. Seamus is only potential romantic interest, and I say that with big air quotes around it, because he and Lavender, which is who I'm talking about, by the way. He and Lavender only went to the Yule Ball as friends. Now Seamus might have had a crush on her, maybe, but that's really just spitballing. There's no way to know for sure, and Lavender is also possibly dead. And she might be alive, seeing as Hermione caught sight of Greyback biting her neck and immediately stunned and or killed him. Given that he dropped out of a window after that, and we know that he's dead. So the next relationship that we are going to discuss, or that I am going to talk about, is Harry and Ron. And I don't know what the ship name for this is, unless it's Horn, which is absolutely hilarious. But I digress. Harry and Ron again is a ship that I really don't have any problem with. Once you get past the roadblock of Ginny and Hermione being married to Harry and Ron respectively, and being in very very fulfilling relationships that aren't about to split up anytime soon. Again, like I said before, I don't have a problem with Harry and Ron being gay at all, or bisexual, as it might be, or in fact any other sexuality which constitutes them liking boys as well as girls. The only major roadblock, like I said before, is their marriages and their families, as in their children. And while I think that it would be really sweet to have Ron and Harry in a relationship getting married, their dynamic again is really much more like best friends rather than potential romantic interests. I don't really know what to say on this one. Again, going into the fanfic territory a little bit. Well, this is all fanfic territory, but going into the actual fanfic writing territory a little bit. The Harry and Ron fanfictions are mostly really very good, I think. I haven't read a lot of them, but I think they're fairly well executed. And one thing that I would want to say about all of the ships that I've said so far are plausible, is that even if the characters are in a relationship, you really don't have to change much to have them care for each other, or to be shown to be in a very very fulfilling sort of relationship. Normally when you have to change the attitude of two characters towards each other in after they begin their relationship, usually with a big grand kiss. I don't know why that's such a popular trope, but it is. If you have to change the character's behavior towards each other after that, that's the sign of a bad relationship. What happens then is, one, your audience kind of loses interest. They basically begin third wheeling, which is what it's called. It's called audience third wheeling, which is not a good thing to have happen, because it can make your audience not invested in your writing or your story anymore. And this doesn't have to happen with any of the potentially functional relationships that I've discovered or discussed. I don't know why I said discovered there, but we're going to keep that in. The biggest example of this is Ginny and Luna, who are already very very caring. They quite obviously are extremely close. Their relationship again is kind of more best friends dynamic rather than a lovers dynamic. Best friends getting into a relationship is, after all, the best kind of relationship, especially in literature and movies and TV or whatever. A stark contradiction to this is Drarry, Draco and Harry, where to make that ship work, you have to completely change up the entire everything about their dynamic. And part of that dynamic, their constant rivalry and almost cartoonish hate towards each other, is what makes their dynamic fun. It's what makes them good characters. I mean, everybody has a rival, everybody has somebody that they just completely hate out of just sheer pure thought and no reasoning. You have that one person in your life. That's what grounds these two children in the middle of a literal war. Like a complete civil war is going on in the wizarding world right now. And both of them are in immediate danger of being murdered by literally the most powerful dark wizard who ever existed. But the thing is, this, childhood rivalry is what grounds them out. It's what balances them, and it's what makes us relate to them. To Harry, not to Draco. Although some people do relate to Draco, that's a tangent for another day. But yes, that's what makes these characters relatable. And all of these relationships that I just pointed out, part of why people like them so much is because it makes these characters relatable to a wider section of society, not just cisgender and heterosexual people. That's why a lot of characters are headcanoned as transgender, and also just to spite J.K. Rowling, which I think is a very noble cause. Considering her, let's just say, how do I put this delicately, BS comments on transphobia and about how sex is real and blah 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 blah, which is all just completely fake and not grounded in science at all. And I mean, again, I don't have anything against these headcanons of characters being transgender, although I do think that Harry would have noticed if, say, Hermione started to spontaneously identify as a guy. I think that would have been a pretty big deal, considering that Harry was her best friend and Ron literally loved her for most of the books. Before I get carried away with my my opinions on several headcanons, this podcast is about Pride Month, and so drop a comment down below if you're watching this on YouTube, or like this video, follow if you're on, say, Spotify or Google Podcasts or a similar platform, and put a little goldfish down in the comments, or like like a smiley. Yeah, put a smiley down in the comments if you think that LGBT plus people deserve to live their lives as they are, and maybe I'll see you next week. Hopefully I'll see you next week. I have a really special podcast coming up for next week, and I might diverge from Harry Potter a little bit, but it is going to come back to, let's just say, the key plot point of Harry Potter in the end. So stay tuned if you want to know what that is, and hopefully I'll see you next week.